start. So I was born in 1951. My newly married parents of 21 and 24 wanted to build a new life for themselves, putting the hardships of World War II behind them and moving away from the austerity of the wartime. My father returned from occupied Japan in 1948, keen to study and provide for his family. Their generation didn't talk about the war to us children, but we internalised their invisible fears as well as their hopes. Not only did we want to move away from the restrictions and the values of the 1940s and 50s, but we wanted to create a meaningful employment and loving relationships in a more peaceful and kinder world. Each generation responds differently to the challenges of their era, carrying some of the hopes and fears of previous generations and the aspirations of their peer group, as well as their own dreams. The children who reached adulthood in the 1960s did this at a time of unprecedented opportunity. When the media and politicians talk about older people letting down the young, I feel a mixture of anger and frustration and dread. Anger and frustration because the lifelong work many of us have been doing to raise the issues about the loss of biodiversity, climate change and social justice over the last 50 years seem to be unnoticed. But also dread because I fear my generation live under the threat of violence and neglect towards us at a time in our lives when we're becoming most vulnerable and when we hope to be valued for our contribution to change. Many of us have been involved in building generational approaches all our lives. I am fearful that the current narrative is dividing us when we most need to work together. In the 60s was a time of outpouring of new ideas. The media often ask now, what happened to the 60s generation? And talk about how nothing really came out of all that energy. This makes me laugh. I want to argue that it's not true. The pioneers of our era have been working hard ever since, trying to bring about change. In the 70s, they were beginning to think about how to put those ideas into practice, and by the 80s, we began to see concrete changes emerge. People took different routes, some as thinkers, others as practical activists, some in mainstream society, pioneering scientists, completing research and developing new ideas. Some even had the ear of government, but often it did not follow up with funding. Other ideas taken up by citizens were often considered utopian, dogged by criticism from governmental bodies, by corporate and business interests, and remained hidden from the mainstream, making slow progress. Often change has been left to citizens or small pioneering businesses like Ecotricity, for instance, to take them forward, rather than become embedded in forward governmental planning. Haphazard funding I can't remember what I was going to say next bit. My own journey started at 14. My horrified parents forbade me from attending the Committee of 100 peace demonstration at Porton Down. For us, nuclear war was a real threat, and we knew this to be an environmental issue as well as about Armageddon. In 1968, at 18, I left home, frustrated with the limitations of family life. I joined a shared household where we discussed politics daily, and I started work. When asked to join a women's consciousness raising group, it was instinctive. I understood how deeply unfair society was for women from observing my own mother's life. Donald Trump's behaviour was commonplace and unsurprising to us, something to navigate, avoid, and find ways to keep ourselves safe. I wanted to see real change in my lifetime. we started to give public talks at schools on feminism and set up a women's refuge. There's no doubt in my mind that the pioneering women of this period brought up their sons to be different, and we can see that today. The term intersectional feminism hadn't been coined in those days. However, quickly it became obvious to me that the oppression of all underprivileged groups was interrelated. I didn't have the language to express that at the time, but knew that we were fighting for the same changes in society. In the 70s, I became involved in the burgeoning environmental movement, took non-violent direct action at the proposed Torness nuclear plant. As the anti-nuclear movement developed in the 80s, joined Women for Life on Earth, became active at Greenham, working with Pacific Islanders, and joined international peace campaigns and later Climate Camp, and during the 90s helped to develop non-violent training for larger groups, despair and empowerment work and eco-psychology, and finally in the 80s I began to learn how to work with new models of sustainability for decision making and to study practical models such as permaculture and biodynamics, organic agriculture, and was a founder member in the transition movement and community food projects. I'd like to ask you 3 questions. If you experience any of these in your lifetime, put your hand up. Did you complete school at the age of 14 and start full-time employment? Did you have a sibling who died of a common treatable illness because your parents were unable to pay for you to see a doctor? Did you go without protein in your diet most days of your childhood? These experiences were commonplace 75 years ago. In my father's time, I realised that part of the current narrative tells us of how the 60s generation have had it all. It's true, we were the beneficiaries of better healthcare, education, social benefits and pensions, and a greater number of people had secure housing and jobs. The narrative is also that we took more from society than we deserve. It concerns me that this rhetoric is currently going unchallenged. Many of us chose not to be involved in organisations that offered fat pensions and huge bonuses and worked for the benefit of others, whether it was the NHS or through charities and organisations working in the forefront of things like fair trade and social justice, biodiversity and the environment, alternative technology. For instance, in 1977, the Centre for Alternative Technology bought an old quarry in Wales that now has thriving university department offering many courses in sustainable practices and researching what we need to do to create a more sustainable world. Citizens fed up with waiting for change pioneered wind power by making small investments in wind turbines when the government would not. Government tried to tell us wind power would not meet our needs, yet now 25% of our energy comes from this pioneering work. I realise that we need to address the experience of younger generation, many of whom have not had secure employment and housing, and those families living in poverty, who find it difficult to feed their families. Their experience of life is moving much closer to that of our grandparents, and it saddens me that we may be the only generation to experience the safety net, and frustrated that the fights that we thought we had won needs to be started again. Young people are asking us why we did nothing to stop climate change and feel let down. I would ask you all, in whose interest has it been that these concerns were not acted on? Most people have children and grandchildren, and many fear for their futures. Those of us who've worked hard to act on their concerns have been despairing in the recent years. Many people have concerns but feel alone with these concerns, according to the writers of the Spirit Level. We set a course for climate change in the 1800s, and since the 60s at least there have been people developing bodies of knowledge about how to deal with this, but we have been mainly relegated to invisibility. The governments of the day have not taken leadership on the issues. Corporate business has used their great wealth to block change, and since Thatcher's era, there's been a slow breakdown in social support that has reached a pinnacle in this decade. We need to decide who are the people holding back change and work on coming together to pull ourselves from the brink of extinction. And I would say that it is corporate power and people who have power over the privileged that hold us back, and not just a blanket group. So some of those people you will find within the older generation, but some of them will be in their 40s and 50s, and some of them even younger than that. So the days of blaming older people make it difficult for us to share our knowledge and experience with you, and holds us back from speaking in public space. We should find out who our allies are from all generations and all classes, and not label people, and work in an intergenerational manner.
Thank you.